Hey, Frank and Arlo, hanging out in the Vanagon. I started shooting this video, the side yard, kind of next to where I take my showers, because it was a nice little quiet spot with really good soft lighting. And the air conditioner kicked on. And that's because even though it was cloudy all day, the sun came out and then boom, it came on, and it just, I don't mind having some noise in these, but I like it to be more like ambient noise. So today, I'm going to tell you why I stopped watching sports. And today is October 30th. What's going on in sports in Philadelphia today is the Phillies are tied 1 game apiece in the World Series with the Houston Astros. They're traveling back to Philadelphia today. Tomorrow night, Game 3 of the World Series starts. Philly's going to be going crazy. And today, also, the Eagles beat the Steelers, and now they're 7-0 on the season. That's the best start to a season that they've had since 2004, and in that year they made it to the Super Bowl, although they lost the Super Bowl to the dreaded New England Patriots. I've always been a Philly sports fan, and my family have been too, especially my dad and my mother's sister, who we called Sis, and I've done a video on her. I remember one time when I was a kid, we were in a restaurant, someplace in either Philadelphia or down the shore in New Jersey. And my dad went, "Oh, look over there, that's Mike Jormalak." I didn't know who that was. He was this giant man who played for the Eagles. And I think he had been retired at that time. I think he played in the 1950s, but my dad watched him, and he knew who this dude was. So he went up and said hi and everything. Another time we were in Hawaii, and I've talked about this in other videos too, when my family went to Hawaii to celebrate Easter. And we were at some hotel, I think it was in Lahaina, Maui, having breakfast, and my dad said, "Hey, there's Norm Van Brocklin. He played for the Phillies." Now, by the time that happened, I had started to become a sports fan. So I was very interested in that. I went over, I met his family. His daughter was my age, and you know, it was like, "Oh yeah, this is my daughter," and you know, we were both very, very uncomfortable. I was 11 or 12 at the time. Now, the year I turned 7, in 1960, the Eagles beat the Packers in the NFL championship. It was before they had the Super Bowl. And I didn't care at 7 years old that happened. I'm sure that my dad watched the game, my aunt watched the game, but I didn't. In 1962, when I turned 9, Wilt Chamberlain, who's from your grandmother's high school, Overbrook High, he was one of the greatest basketball players ever. Just a giant guy. Towered above most other people. Although he was the second best center at the time, because there was a guy named Bill Russell that was on these teams that kept winning championships. Wilt might have been a little better than him, but he probably wasn't a little better than him. But I didn't care so much about that then, that the Warriors left. there were teams that would leave Philadelphia. There were the A's, which were the Philadelphia A's. They won some World Series. They wound up going out to Kansas City for a while, and then eventually wound up in Oakland. But I've never been fans of the Warriors or the A's, any teams that left the city. Well, Philadelphia at the time was the 4th largest city in the country, and they needed an NBA team. So this, I don't know how this happened, but the Syracuse Nationals, the Nats, were moved from Syracuse to Philadelphia with a guy named Hal Greer, who was this awesome player. I think he was a guard. And I was starting to become a fan at this point in time. I was 10 years old. I was from a family that liked sports. I would see sports on, and I was interested. I got hooked as a Philadelphia sports fan in 1964. The Phillies were a lock to go to the World Series. The next closest team to them was the Cardinals, and there was no way the Cardinals could catch them. Well, there was a way, and they did catch them. They got so close to being in the World Series that they printed up tickets. And I think somewhere up in the attic, I have those tickets. If I find them before I publish this, I'll take a picture of them and put them on there. They sold them as, you know, collectible items. Hey, here's some Phillies World Series tickets from the 1964 World Series that they never got in. I listened to every game I could on radio. There weren't that many games on TV at the time. Like, they would, I think, have the Sunday games, and some of the Saturday games would be on. But quite often we'd be out. We would either be at the shore, which meant that I couldn't see them, or we would go to the cemetery to visit my little brother's grave and my grandparents' grave. And then we would go out to eat someplace. But my dad sometimes would have the game on in the car, and I got used to listening to the games on radio, and I quite often would listen to them. One time, we went to dinner at a friend of my parents' house, and it was a crucial game. So I sat out in the car, ran down the battery probably, and listened to that game, and they lost. And I remember thinking, and this is something that you have to guard against. I remember thinking that maybe it's me. Maybe I would have better luck if I started rooting against them. Maybe if I root against them, they'll win. So I rooted against them and they won. Then I rooted against them the next day and they lost. But I was devastated. Young man, 11 years old, just turned 11. And my heroes, Johnny Callison and Jim Bunning, they failed me. Now, I've never been a sports fan. I'm involved in sports. I'm involved in running. I'm involved in surfing. I'm involved in cycling. And I've watched the Tour de France, but I'm not a cycling fan. I was a Lance Armstrong fan, and I still am. I could care less that he cheated just like everybody else, and he got caught just like some of them did. I mean, so many people cheated sports. It's almost what sports are about. And I'm not saying that, oh yeah, it's great that people cheat. but it's competitive, so people are going to try to have every competitive edge. And I don't think what Lance did was like him putting some kind of super serum in his body. All that I've ever discovered in looking at Lance Armstrong is that he did this thing called, I forget what it's called, but you take your own blood out, you collect your own blood and store it, and then pump blood in so you have extra blood, but it's your own blood. And but I was hooked as a Philly sports fan, and that's what I've been my entire life, almost my entire life. Now, I've had some jerseys, but I've never been that guy face painted up in green and silver, like out there with wings on in the stands going, fly, Eagles fly, all that kind of stuff. I've always, when I've been at games, I've always sat and watched. I'm not a cheering guy, like, yeah, just not that guy. I've had, let's see, I had a Flyers jersey at one point in time. It was a generic one, didn't have anybody's name on the back. I remember wearing it in Atlanta at Hartsfield International Airport back when they had the Atlanta Flames, and somebody going, boo, as I walked through the airport. Another time I had a Donovan McNabb jersey, which I traded to a guy in Costa Rica for some Costa Rican soccer jersey, which I didn't know anything about the jersey or the team. I don't think it was the national team. I think it was some local team. I've worn T-shirts in the past. I've worn hats. I've had like an Eagles hat and a Flyers hat. But I'm not, you know, I'm representing the team kind of guy. Because it's more than that, and I'll get into that in a minute. Now, in 74 and 75, the Flyers won easy for me to say. The Flyers won 2 Stanley Cups. I was in Houston. I was watching the Houston Aeros. I went to see a couple games. I remember when my brother Richard came, I took him to an Aeros game, and we saw that the Howe brothers with their dad. So Gordie Howe, if you're a hockey fan, you know who Gordie Howe is. Well, his 2 sons, Mark and Marty Howe, and he were, I think, on the same line, although I know that when Mark Howe played for the Flyers, he was a defenseman. But I sort of remember them being out there on the front line at the Aeros games. But then I moved to Kansas City, and I went to see Kansas City Blues. The Kansas City Blues were way different than the Houston Aeros. The Houston Aeros were a brand new league. I think it was called the World Hockey League or World Hockey Association. And they were like trying to take away market from the NHL. Like, hey, we can start our own league. And eventually some of the WHA teams went into the NHL. But at the time, the league was pretty new, and it had a lot of awesome superstars from the past who weren't going to be able to play at the NHL level anymore. But they were big attractions for people to go see them at the WHA games. And so that, and Gordie Howe was one of those guys. I think he was like close to 50 years old at this point in time. He played forever. They were fun games to watch. But hey, I never became this rabid Houston fan. When I lived in different cities, I always thought, yeah, I'm going to start to watch the local team, and I never do. I was in Miami for 10 years, and I watched like maybe 5 minutes of a Dolphins game, and I just went like, why? Why spend 3 hours on this? And I'll tell you why in a few minutes. I didn't want to spend 3 hours on that. In 1976, Flyers lost in the Stanley Cup Finals. I forget who they lost to. In 76, 77, and 78, the Phillies got into the National League Championship Series, and they lost. I think once to the Reds and twice to the Dodgers. And I came home. 1977, I got out of the Air Force, and I came home. And I would watch games. I would listen to games. I would follow the teams. I would read the stories. When I was on my way to work, if I was taking the subway, the elevated, the bus, anything like that, I would have the Philadelphia Daily News, and I would always read the sports page before I read everything else. If I got done the sports page and still had some commute left, then I would read the news. In 80, the Phillies won the World Series. The city went crazy. Even though the World Series was a lot of fun to watch, the real excitement was in the National League Championship Series. The Phillies played the Houston Astros, and I think they won it in 5 games. So they won 4. The Astros only won 1. But if I remember, every game was back and forth. And you didn't know who was going to win until the last inning. I didn't get to go to any of those games. Frankie, your dad was born by then. Tom, yours wasn't born by then. Frank, your dad was born in late December of 1979. And Arlo, your dad was born in July of 1981. So we're talking about like October, November 1980. I was working at Wanamaker's. I didn't have a lot of money. I never should have taken the day off. But I looked out of the window. I worked on the 11th floor, and there were people everywhere dressed in red. And they were all going south. And I said to my boss, if I want to take off, will you let me go? And he said, sure, Frank. Adolf Kurtzman was his name. Very nice man. Sure, you want to take off? And I did. And I walked from Wanamaker's, which is across the street from City Hall, all the way down to JFK Stadium. I got there before the parade did. So instead of seeing the parade on South Broad Street, I was in JFK Stadium and saw the parade come in, and they went a few times around, and everybody went crazy. I grabbed a 6-pack on the way and just hung out and had a great time. In 1980, the Flyers lost the World Series. But I was a Flyers fan, a Phillies fan, an Eagles fan, and usually most of these teams, if they weren't really good, they sucked. It's a Philadelphia thing. We'll talk about the Philadelphia thing more. The Sixers had Dr. J, Julius Erving, Moses Malone, Bobby Jones, the sixth man, and Andrew Toney. If I thought about it, I'd think about some more of the greatest Sixers ever. Their coach was Billy Cunningham, who had been the greatest Sixers player when he was playing until Dr. J came along. And they beat the Lakers. They beat the Boston Celtics, which is their perennial foe, on their way to the championship series with the Lakers. And when it was evident in Boston Gardens that the Celtics were going to lose, the Celtics fans started chanting, "Beat LA, beat LA, beat LA." I don't like Boston, but I liked them that day. Boston's kind of like a wannabe Philadelphia. We're both like moons of New York City. You have Boston, Philly, Baltimore, not so much DC, and we're the moons of New York City. We're the little kids of our big daddy, New York City, and so most people in Philadelphia, they don't care about Baltimore because we don't have a reason to. We don't play them regularly in any sporting events, but we hate New York City teams and we hate Boston teams. We just do. In 1984, I was dating this woman named Anita Bonacci. She lived in South Philly at 17th and Moore. And we used to go hang out at this bar called the Palladium. And one day one night there was a guy sitting there in the bar. And I was looking at him like, man, that guy looks familiar. But I don't know where I know him from. Well, it turned out his name was Jim Mora. He was the coach of the Philadelphia Stars, the USFL. And I never became friends with him or anything like that, but I would see him in there. He would come over after practice and hang out, have a couple beers and go home. And he was a nice guy. I didn't try to act like I could tell him how to run his team or anything like that, which most sports fans are like. But I'm not that guy. I would talk to him about all kinds of things, and he was a cool guy. Well, he won 2 USFL championships with the Philadelphia Stars. And the first time they won was in 1984. I was a cop in the 17th District. And they called us in because like, oh, the Stars are going to win the game and we have to have like crowd control. And I remember there were like 20 people that came out for the Stars parade. In the late 1980s, when I was still a cop, I had become friends with some of the people that worked with my girlfriend Judy at Hahnemann Hospital. And one guy was John Contino. He had a Super Bowl party every year, and one year Judy said to me, "Hey, John asked if you want to go watch the Super Bowl at his house." So I said, yeah, and it was kind of neat because the people that were there were real sports fanatics, but one of them was a guy named Al Meltzer, who was a sportscaster in Philadelphia. And, I mean, he wasn't this big star because he would have been at the Super Bowl if he was. But he was a cool guy. And then another guy that was there, I don't remember his name, but he was some sort of a statistician for the Flyers. These guys knew a lot about sports. They were cool guys. The only thing is that Al Meltzer and I were the only ones that weren't doctors. So when they talked doctor stuff, we were kind of like, oh, great, that's great. And then I left the police department. And trust me, I'll get to why I left watching sports. I became a stockbroker. I just did a video about how I became a stockbroker. But the first thing that they did after they hired me was they sent me to New York City for, I think, a month to take classes. So we're in class the first day. And we go around, we're saying our names, where we're from, maybe a little bit about ourselves. And this one guy says, "Hi, my name's Jim Bakken. I'm from St. Louis." And he said whatever else he said. But he didn't say, "I used to kick for the St. Louis Cardinals." But I was thinking, what an odd coincidence that would be. If a guy with the name Jim Bakken, B-A-K-K-E-N, from St. Louis, wasn't the guy. And in fact, he had that build of a football player, and he was still in pretty good shape. He just had the look. And I went up to him, and I said, "Hey, you used to play for the Cardinals?" He said, "Yeah, I did." And I said, "The only football game I've ever been to," and at the time that was true, was a game, and I think it ended in a 6-6 tie, where Jim Bakken and Tom Dempsey each kicked 2 field goals, and that was the only scoring of the game. It was at Franklin Field. I don't even know when it was, probably the early 70s, the late 60s. Don't even remember. I guess my dad took me. Oh, good. Oh, that's Jerry leaving on his little Jerry mobile. So Tom Dempsey was kind of a fascinating guy. He had a club foot. So whatever his kicking foot was, I think it was his right foot, it didn't have a whole foot there. He just had a partial foot, so it was this stub. And he could kick the ball forever. Now, he wasn't the most accurate guy, but he held records. I think he held the longest field goal record until sometime in the last couple of years. And this guy, Jim Bakken, shared a story with me. He said that this kid came up and said, "Mr. Bakken, can I have your autograph on one of your football cards?" And football cards are these things, you have baseball cards. Every sport has the playing cards. They come out every year, and kids collect them, and they trade them. And, it's like an underground economy with sports cards. And he said, "Sure, son." He signed it. Gave it to him. He gave him another one and said, "Will you sign a second one?" And he said, "Sure." Signed it. Gave it to him. The kid gave him a third Jim Bakken card and said, "Will you sign this one?" And he said, "Well, I have to ask you, why do you need me to sign 3 cards?" And he said, "Well, everybody knows it takes 3 Jim Bakkens to get 1 Tom Dempsey," which meant that you would have to trade 3 of Jim Bakken's trading cards that were signed to get 1 Tom Dempsey signed by him. And in '93, the Phillies went to the World Series and lost to the Orioles, and in '97, Flyers lost in the Stanley Cup Finals. It was kind of rough sailing, even though I still followed sports until 2004. The Eagles had an amazing year. They got to the Super Bowl. They lost the Super Bowl. They had Terrell Owens and Donovan McNabb, of course. Right after that, loss, I went to Israel. I'm going to do a video on my trip to Israel. It was very, very eventful. And then in 2006, I was diagnosed with a cancer. And as I was recuperating, getting back on my feet again, the Phillies were my companions. I don't know how else to say it. They were my companions. I would lay in bed, hardly able to move, and I would watch Ryan Howard crush a home run, Jimmy Rollins screech around the bases, and it just made me feel better. Well, in 2008, those guys went to the World Series and they won, and I got to go to a game. Now, I had been to a playoff game before. I was to a game in 1993 with my brother when the Phillies beat the Atlanta Braves and got into the World Series and lost to the Toronto Blue Jays. But this one, I went and they won, and I had my first beer. Now, I started getting my cancer treatments in November of 2006. And in October or early November, depending on when the game was, in 2008, I had not had a beer that entire time. And if you know anything about me, you know that I like beer. 2010, the Flyers again lost in the Stanley Cup Finals. But by then, I had left Philly. I was living in Miami, and I wasn't watching many games. As I say, I got to, I would go to places and try to like their teams, but I didn't. And I didn't go out of my way to go see an Eagles game someplace if it wasn't available in the local market. It meant a lot to me, but apparently it didn't mean as much as I thought. And in 2013, we went to New Orleans for my 60th birthday, and I rode 30 miles to commemorate my birthday. It was on a rental bike. I wanted to do 60 miles, but it was a clunker of a bike. It would have taken me all day. Your grandmother would have kicked my butt when I got home at midnight saying, oh, I rode 60 miles. So I just did 30, and I decided that every year I was going to ride 1 mile for every year that I was turning on my birthday. But I didn't do it on my actual birthday because in Miami, it's hot as hell on August 5th. Every year. It's not like some year I'd go, oh yeah, it's pretty nice out. No, it was always hot as hell on August 5th. So I did it on February 5th each year. In 2018, the Eagles were in the Super Bowl. It was the 2017 season. And we did 63 miles. I think we went from, let's see, the campground that we were staying in Key Largo down to the 7 Mile Bridge and back. It was Tom and me and Stephen Jaramillo, who was the guy that I worked with at the IRS Office of Appeals. Each year, it was different people doing it, but Tom did it, I think, every year, and Stephen did it most of the years. Also, a guy named Tim Vaughn's, he did it with me and his son TJ sometimes. It became the Clarkie's ride, Clarkie's birthday ride. Well, got to watch the Eagles win the Super Bowl in Key Largo. But it wasn't just watching the Eagles win the Super Bowl in Key Largo. It was watching it at Jimmy Johnson's restaurant. Jimmy Johnson had a restaurant in Key Largo because he had been the coach of the Miami Hurricanes. Very successful coach with them. Then he went on to be a very successful coach of the hated Dallas Cowboys. Now, Jimmy wasn't there for the Super Bowl. I asked about it, and they said he was away doing a speech or something. Likely story. The day after the Super Bowl, we did the ride. Tom and I, and Arlo, your mom, was there too. We camped. We put a couple tents up at this campground. And then Stephen came down the next day after the Super Bowl and rode with us, and then he went home. We had a great time. Since then, I've watched the available Eagles games, but not as many as you would think that I would. Like, I never went out of my way. I never wanted to pay extra money to get the NFL package or any sports package. Now, in the last couple years, for some reason, professional sports has decided that their employees, the players, are more important than their customers, which is somebody like me. And they went woke. What is woke? Woke is this theory that you can run a society so you have equal outcomes for everybody. And the way that they do that, and I'm not going to go into this in too much depth, is they almost assign scores to everybody for how oppressed they are. So if you're a white male, your score is 0. You've had it easy your entire life. Doesn't matter if you're from the poorest neighborhood, raised by scumbags, doesn't matter. Your score is 0. If you're like a black female lesbian with a hair lip and 4 toes on each foot, you have a score of 57. You're like, ding, 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 ding. You win. And so the people with the lower scores have no say in anything. And the people with high scores, they get to go, yeah, this is the way that the world should be. And I think that sucks. Like, I don't care what players believe and what they don't believe. I never understood why they played the national anthem. And that was one of the things that started it all, is this guy, Colin Kaepernick, kneeled during the national anthem. You're supposed to stand during it. I never understood why they played the national anthem at a freaking football game or anything else. Now, I do understand why they play it at the Olympics, because that's country versus country. Today, very, very interesting watching the beginning of the Jaguars playing who did they play? The Denver Broncos in London at Wimbledon Stadium. They did the Star Spangled Banner, and right after that, they did God Save the King. And it was funny, too, because that's the first time I heard them sing the song that way, because my entire life, there was a Queen of England. It was the same person, Queen Elizabeth II. And so when they started singing it, I'm like, God Save the King? What are they talking about? Well, she just died a little while ago, and now it's God Save the King. And I thought, well, yeah, that's really appropriate. But I don't understand why, when 2 American teams are playing each other, that they do the national anthem. But it's what they do. And I don't care if people kneel on the sideline or they play with themselves on the sideline during the national anthem. I don't care about any of that stuff. But I don't want it shoved down my throat. And they started shoving it down my throat. And so I said, well, that's enough. I'm not going to buy their product. They're not going to tell me how to think. So I stopped watching. maybe a month ago, I turned on an Eagles game by mistake. And I went, oh man, I missed this. I miss being able to watch the birds. And I said, well, let's see what happens if I watch a little bit of it. And Jason Kelsey's a center on the team, very good player, got hurt, and he was on the sideline, and he had some hat on it that had equality, and that's their whole thing, is equality. Instead of everybody having an equal opportunity, they want you to have an equality of the outcome. Like, everybody has to finish the same. And people like me believe that we want to make it so everybody starts the same. And some people will go up real high, and some people will just go, ooh, you know, and be mediocre. That's how life is. And he had that on, and I thought, well, hey, I can deal with this guy wearing this hat, because I don't care. I don't care. I'm assuming that if you were some red, white, and blue conservative guy, and you had some conservative habit on, that they wouldn't say anything about you. Now, that's probably not true, but I just assumed that. And I started to think, how dare you? How dare you, professional sports? I was like Greta Thunberg. How dare you? How dare you take this away from me? Because it really isn't sports that I'm a fan of, because I don't watch the Super Bowl if the Eagles aren't in it. I don't watch the Stanley Cup Finals if the Flyers aren't in it. World Series if the Phillies aren't in it. An NBA championship if the Sixers aren't in it. I'm not interested. I'm interested in Philadelphia teams winning. Why? Because I've been a lot of things in my life, but there's two things that I'll always be. I'll always be a Philadelphian, and I'll always be a Kenzo. It's where I grew up. It's where my parents grew up. It's part of my DNA now. And they took that away from me. And I was going to do this video next week, but this morning, I went to the American Legion for breakfast, because grandmother's prepping for this procedure tomorrow, and there's no food. We're not having food in the house today. And I went in there, and just to get breakfast. The game was on. So as I was sitting there, there's 50,000 TVs all over the place. I couldn't help but watch the Jaguars game, because we're in Jacksonville and it's their team. I went into the kitchen to get my food, and the two people in there, the guy had a Phillies shirt on. The Phillies are in the World Series. And I said, you from Philly? Yeah, I am. Where? He said, I'm from Frankfurt. I said, get out of here. I'm a Kenzo. And he said, oh, you're willing to admit that, huh? I said, yeah, I'm a proud Kenzo. His wife was from Mayfair. Later, I tried to watch the Eagles game, because the second part of this story is why I came back to watching these. And it's because they can't take that away from me. They can't take the fact that I'm a Philly sports fan away from me. Now, I'm not gonna watch any of that other stuff anyway. I don't care about, you know, the Houston Astros, other than the fact that they're playing the Phillies. I'm not gonna watch their games. Except, well, in 2017 I did, and that was in another video, why I did that. The game wasn't on in Jacksonville, so I said to your grandmother, I'm going over and see if they have it on at the American Legion. So I went back over there. There was a steak sandwich place that was serving food, because they don't cook food inside on Sundays. They have food trucks, and this was a place called Boats and Hoagies. Was there. I had a steak sandwich. Guy had an Eagles shirt on, Eagles hat on. I said, you from Philly? And he said, yeah. What part of Philly? South Philly. Then I went inside, with my food. The bartender had an Eagles shirt on. Her name's Katie. I said, "You from Philly?" "Yeah, I'm from Philly." "What part?" "I'm from Northeast Philly." Well, it turns out that she lived at, I think, Cotman and Levick, which is maybe 10 blocks from where me and your fathers lived in the late 80s and early 90s in Northeast Philly. And if it wasn't for Philadelphia sports, I wouldn't know that. I wouldn't know these people. Now I have new friends that are from where I'm from. We have that in common. And I love being in Jacksonville. It's a cool place. I don't miss Philadelphia, the place, but I miss Philadelphia, the culture that I grew up in. People from Philly think about things differently. And I'm sure people from everywhere think about things differently. But I'm not from those other places. And I never have been able to become a Dolphins fan. When I lived in Los Angeles, I didn't become a Dodgers fan. I lived in Houston, I didn't become an Astros fan. I'll always be a Philadelphia sports fan. And that's why, even though I took some time off and didn't watch, I came back, because they ain't going to take that away from me. Peace out, guys.